Welcome to the Zigmund Reichenbach Show with the great Christian Watson. You're back. Happy to broadcast with y'all in the midst of a very troubling time. It is 1000% difficult to follow all that's going on, and we just hope to be able to keep you updated about the trends in politics and philosophy. And if we get to it, we will discuss Ukraine and all that jazz. And if not, we may do it at another time. But we have a great show here for you with the articles that you can find at zigmundreichenbach.com. And make sure to like and share the stream that we have, so that way we can continue to share these ideas. Here's the rundown for today's show. We have a discussion of media monarchy, equal branches of government, and whether or not that was really discussed by the founders. Ignore and rebuild, our strategy for dealing with socialism, in Marx, academics, and exploitation. So that's on the docket today. That's what we got. In the meantime, we're happy to have our great friend back, Christian Watson. Christian, what's up, brother?
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, hello. Sorry, my internet went off for a little bit. Yeah, hello.
Okay,
happy to be here. Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. And what's been new in the world for you, Christian?
Oh yeah, well, a lot of things. I spent the weekend at a conference called the Carolina Liberty Conference, put on by a great organization called John Locke Foundation, which does a lot of local statewide work in North Carolina for the causes of liberty, whether it be anti-licensing things, whether it be supporting the Second Amendment, whether it be other kind of affirmations of our natural individual rights. I've also been not on a speaking tour, but I went to Gainesville, Florida last week to go speak about the delusion of diversity politics to their college Republicans chapter. So things have been great for me. And I released my first piece of original content on my channel of the year about the Canadian Freedom Convoy. And there's certainly more to come in that respect as well. So things have been good for me. Hope things have been well for you as well.
It's been going all right. It's been a hectic thing. We did a big thing for work with our state representative to discuss all the scandalous stuff happening in Harrisburg as it pertains to the budget. But there's more scandal than just that. We have scandals like the media monarchy. And actually, the article title that I wrote for last Monday, Biden and the Presidential Media Monarchy, seems like it takes aim at Biden's presidency, but what I'm really trying to suggest here is that is a silver lining of his administration, is his unwillingness and incapability to appear on TV. What a great thing to not have to suffer through all these bad presidential speeches where they do nothing but utter platitudes. And what I said was that as far as the silver lining of the Biden presidency, him not showing up on TV, that should indeed become the gold standard of presidential behavior. Christian, what are your thoughts on getting rid of the presidential media monarchy and kind of undoing that to help restore the constitutional order? Would it help restore the constitutional order? Or am I perhaps being a little obtuse here?
If I wouldn't say you're being obtuse, so to speak. I think you're being a little bit too hopeful, though. So here's what I would say about that. If we were having this conversation back in the 70s or even the 80s, I would say having presidents not appear on TV might not be that big of a problem. But in an era in which the instant gratification of amazingly fast information fuels the lives and the understanding of so many people, this sort of digital age that we live in, having a non-transparent presidency is considered almost a slight to the norm. Now, of course, this is not a good enough reason to continue this tradition, because the norms throughout history have been based on faulty or erroneous or immoral ideas. But having said that, I don't think the idea of presidential transparency, which is what this normal president's appearing on TV and now in the digital age tweeting or going on Facebook and releasing things on YouTube channel, that norm is not bad. For as long as the government is involved in as many things that it's involved in, I want to know what the thinking is of the person who's in the chief executive's office. The problem with Biden is that he is an older gentleman. He is clearly someone who struggles to even get through basic pre-written speeches, much less very long press conferences, which in many cases he pre-picks the answers, pre-picks the questions. So in his case in particular, I think it just shows a sense of weakness on his part. Now, if this is President Trump, then perhaps we could say, yeah, maybe it would be a good thing for the president not to have such a public appearance in the media, because if Trump breathed, the media would have reported it. Just a mere him breathing is a news story. But again, the foundational principle is fine. Transparency is important.
Well, sure. And that's what I'm trying to get at here and point and suggest that perhaps that idea is mistaken, because as it describes in the Federalist, the person who's supposed to have the strongest relationship with individuals is their representatives. Fundamentally so. That's the actual order. And what I'm trying to suggest is that these appearances on TV actually undermine that normal U.S. Federalist order, and instead puts presidents over the individual reps, and therefore people feel a greater loyalty to a president, such that it's almost dictatorial, where that allegiance to a former president can lead people to do needless and perhaps in many cases dangerous things. And I think if we were to undo what I'm calling the presidential media monarchy here, for the lack of a more concise term, then maybe we would be able to get back to federalism, and moreover, maybe we'd be able to cut out some of the noise in politics that presidents, quite frankly, are encouraged to make.
I don't think your point follows, my good sir. I think that it's an interesting point, but doesn't follow. The idea that the presidential media monarchy is causing this superimposition of the president over a state representative is not true. The culture of politics created by government intrusions into places where it should not be, and then compounded by the already grandiose duties and responsibilities of a president, are what allows the president to have this sort of superimposed status over a representative. It's the extent of each of their duties, right? So a state representative obviously plays in state politics, but a lot of people don't pay attention to state politics. They rather care about national politics. And why does national politics matter so much? Because so many things that affect local life are decided on a national level, which of course is a complete violation of what the Federalist Papers and Federalists wanted to get at. I get that, but you don't fix that simply by taking away the magnifying glass. You have to attack what the magnifying glass is looking at. So the president's appearing on TV is not the problem. The fact that the president has so much power and the executive branch has so much power, that's the problem. You fix that first, then we can talk about getting rid of the magnifying glass.
Yeah, here's what I'm suggesting, that those two things are reciprocally magnified by each other, where the power that they have is further amplified by what goes on in TV, where I think that we can help cut back on the amount of influence and kind of make that a norm, where gradually over time, if you look at this book, it's called The Rhetorical Presidency, where more and more presidents kept on giving more and more speeches, longer speeches, where the norm wasn't at the end of the 18th century for presidents to do these big listening tours. In fact, that really didn't come into prominence until, probably right around Wilson's time. So it seems like the original order was set such that presidents would appear less often in public. And that seems to me to be a greater indicator of how things are supposed to go, where now we allow them to be on TV so much, and that actually gives them more power, just in virtue of us giving them our attention, where by taking our attention away from things, then we can change the ordering. In other words, I'm arguing that our attention is a form of power. And we
I
let
understand
people
your argument.
have power over us by giving them that attention.
Yeah.
And we could change things by just reallocating our power or our attention, I would say, to maybe independent journalists or independent coverage of what the president's saying or
Yeah.
content creators. And
Well,
I think that would help decentralize power. Right.
I understand your point. I don't think I agree entirely, though. I do agree that we should focus our attention elsewhere. I don't agree that focusing our attention elsewhere necessarily break down the amount of influence. I like the term influence as opposed to power. Influence the president has over the political landscape. Because again, the president has been made a very important figure throughout history, throughout the illicit expansions of government. And that tradition of bequeathing power where it does not belong, that's the real problem. The magnification of the image and the presence of the president is simply a symptom of that. You can get rid of a symptom without actually curing the sickness. So I say we get rid of this, we attack the sickness first, and then maybe the symptoms will go away. Actually, the symptoms will definitely go away. I don't think just turning our attention elsewhere, especially in an age where the president has so much power and authority to impact our liberties, i.e., Joe Biden being able to order the administrative state to force people to take something they don't want to take in their bodies. We should not be turning our attention away from them. We should be watching them like a hawk, because when we don't watch them like a hawk, injustice can occur. Let me give you an example. When Barack Obama signed the NDAA to 2012, most media outlets didn't cover that. But that bill, and the NDAA, of course, is just a regular appropriations bill passed to fund the military. But that particular NDAA included an indefinite detention provision, I think, which the court struck down, I believe. I'm not entirely sure. But no one covered that, where the president could quite literally indefinitely detain you if he suspects you of terrorism. So I think in some areas, there needs to be more attention paid on the president because of how much power he has. I'll ignore the president when he cannot break my limb or take my property. It doesn't follow that if I just ignore the president or look away, things will get better. No. I have to kill the sickness first. Then I can look away.
Yeah.
That's my opinion. That's my opinion.
No, that's sensible enough. I think part of the article, or the point, is that with the president passed, perhaps it was too much, and the silver lining to a more respectable level would indeed be healthy or healthier for more people involved, and would also help to curb the limits that presidents have. But your point is well taken. It just seems like in many cases, somebody like a press secretary, for example, that actually gives the president a greater opportunity to put to be confusing or unclear, and actually
I agree.
To put less information out. So you have these guys blathering on, and then meanwhile, people have no clue what's going on in their state. So I think people have to pick and choose. Should we give greater attention to what's going on in our state, which I can tell you, working as a grassroots organizer, Christian, most people don't have any clue about anything that's going on in any state, anywhere at all. And I think that people could consciously make the trade-off to say, hey, listen, I'm not going to give these presidential nitwits my power or influence through my attention, and I'm actually going to work in an area where I can make a better change. So that's the general idea.
I think your general idea, I think you're touching on something really good, because you're right. A lot of people have no idea who even their local city council member is, much less their state representative or their lieutenant governor or whatever. That's a problem. That's a big problem. And we can also, the merits of the press secretary's office, that's a different conversation. That's a different conversation, because I think the press secretary is essentially a propaganda minister. This may sound this may sound a little bit like World War II language, but the press secretary is a propaganda minister who is there to spin, and move the goalposts. Basically, the press secretary takes up the responsibility of being the president's voice without having the consistency that someone who is in that arena should have. And that's a problem. So no. I think we probably would agree that maybe there shouldn't. Remember that one time, remember that period of time when President Trump just stopped all press conferences with the press secretary he had? He just stopped them. He ceased them. Remember that?
Yeah, it was awesome.
Well, Yeah, I think that now that's good. He never went away, of course. He was always on Twitter, but that's good because we had less propaganda. Because even Republican governments have propaganda, obviously. We had less propaganda, less spin,
Yep.
and I think the headlines were less clogged with, oh, the press secretary said this today, or this today, or this today, and it was more clogged with things that were not that. Those are my thoughts on that. I agree with you.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think we're generally at the same perspective. How we solve the problem is perhaps a
Yeah,
different matter, and certainly something that, regardless of whatever the true answer is, I think at least identifying the problem has a problem is
yeah,
is substantial, because I don't think people have consciously tracked how much power the president has gotten through the media, except for in that excellent book, The Rhetorical Presidency, which is awesome, and I think all people should read. In fact, I might go back and read it again.
I
And
will definitely.
that actually dovetails nicely into the next article that I wrote about. There's no such thing as co-equal branches of government. At least that's not what the founders intended.
Mm,
If you look in the Federalist Papers, there's two instances where the founders mention co-equal branches. In fact, in Federalist 51, it says, in a Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And I don't know any other way to construe the term necessarily as other than it should and it does, and this is how it is. That's what Madison says quite clearly. And in the other instances where they talk about a co-equal branch, they're just talking about the House and Senate being co-equal to one another. They're not talking about the judiciary being co-equal to the legislator, or the president being co-equal to the legislator. And then in the second instance, when Hamilton mentions co-equal, he mentions it in the context of the British House of Commons being co-equal with the aristocracy and the king over time. But he's not saying that our system is modeled on that. In fact, if you read the Federalist, he's actually denying that. So I just mentioned all this to say, Christian, I think that this is important because people use the idea of a co-equal branch of government to justify judicial activism and executive orders. And I don't see anywhere in the Federalist where that's the case.
Do you see anywhere in the Constitution where that's the case? Because, for context, the Federalist Papers, as I understand them, were the articulation of one of the camps that was trying to form the Constitution in its early days, the Federalist. Then, of course, there were the Anti-Federalists, and they came together. Of course, as you know, the Zigmund Compromise built the Constitution. Some Anti-Federalists did not sign the Constitution. Some people did not sign it because they didn't believe in it, Patrick Henry being one of them. So in the Constitution, this idea of co-equal branch of government, which I've heard get into it in a way that has allowed this abuse to happen? Or has this been a sort of a new age interpretation introduced by the judiciary or introduced by laws that are not adhering to the original spirit of the Constitution? I'm asking in true humility because I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's good, Christian. So to go back to the original thing that you mentioned first, we were talking about the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. Really, what's going on is the Federalists and are sometimes miscalled the Federalist Papers, which is not what they're actually titled, but
okay,
it's not here or there. But in those papers, what Hamilton is trying to do is Hamilton, Madison, and Jay is they're trying to justify adding on a national government to the existing sovereign states. So that's what they're trying to justify. And they're trying to do that because that's what the ratification of the Constitution is centered on. Basically, what a more perfect union means, we're adding a unified national government on top of these sovereign states. And so therefore, the Federalist is like the game, the political game that we're playing, and the Constitution just formalizes the rules and principles as described in the Federalist. And so That's why I always go back to the Federalist, because the Constitution is just a set of laws. The Federalist is the underlying theory that justifies
Yes.
those
Okay.
laws. But if you actually look in the Constitution itself, it doesn't even mention the term branch more than once.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's again a fundamental falsehood that we have such a thing as co-equal branches. It clearly says in Federalist 51 that the legislative branch necessarily predominates. And I think that that's how it should be. We shouldn't have activist judges, and we shouldn't
Mhm.
have presidents
Right.
that have these vast authorities. And if you
Right.
believe otherwise, you are literally arguing against what the founders are saying. That's the point that I'm trying to make.
Yes, I think you're entirely correct. I obviously need to go back and reread the Federalist paper. I've read some of them, not all of them, so
Yeah.
I'll admit that. But no, I mean, I think a lot of what you're saying sounds like it's the right interpretation of the Constitution. And I think that, just to add a point about the judicial branch, you know, judicial review, as you know, and as some people in the audience might know, was a internally invented privilege by the judiciary. Marbury versus Madison. And that internally invented privilege, I say internally because it came from within that branch of government itself, rather than being bestowed upon. Well, obviously, the courts can interpret the law, right? But that internally invented privilege went from simple mere interpretation to creating prescriptions from interpretation that go beyond the bounds of what the judiciary was originally meant to do. So this is why when you have a self-regulating body, typically you have to ask, okay, where is there, like, are they able to partially and objectively regulate themselves if they're the ones whose interests are at stake? And of course, if the judiciary is regulating itself in its own power and their interests are at stake, they're probably not going to restrict themselves. And that's a problem. And that's something that Congress should address, that that needs to be addressed, and that people in the judiciary need to address as well. And thankfully, there have been President Trump, for all of his ills, he did put in judges, many of whom have no interest in writing law from the bench. In fact, I think it was his judges that have actually struck down the COVID mandates in many areas on the federal level. So I think that it's important to understand that when a body regulates itself, that's probably not a good thing. In this case, at least, because it will never regulate itself against its own interests, unless they're masochists, then I guess. Or maybe not even then.
No, but
what do you think about that?
Perhaps a bigger animating idea behind what I'm trying to articulate here is that if Congress is not meant to be co-equal, then members of Congress should not act like the other branches are indeed equal. That's only perpetuating their own weakness and inability to do anything. I mean, it's factually not true. It's not what the Federalist says, and there is no excuse to delegate powers, because again, that's not what it says. And yet at the same time, you'll have these lawmakers swear up and down that they love the Constitution, they love this, they love that. Well, how many lawmakers actually stepped up to challenge Biden's illegal mandate? I can tell you it was only a few initially. One of them was actually from my former congressman, Fred Keller. He utilized the Congressional Review Act to say, hey, Biden cannot do this. And more people in Congress, if they're the great constitutionalists that they proclaim to be, have a moral, legal, political, spiritual obligation to do so. And
I agree.
I just try to lay that out, Christian, in a neat way, because I just don't think our conceptualization of what Congress is supposed to be is clear enough. And then as a result of that, Congress doesn't do what it's supposed to do because people don't know what Congress is supposed to be. And then they invent all these other solutions to a problem that's invented by Congress not being what it was.
Right. I think you're absolutely correct. And it's interesting to me, Zygmunt. Congress seems to mobilize its own authority against the judiciaries when the stakes are in whatever controlling party's favor. We've seen a very good example of this recently. Chuck Schumer said he was going to try to pass the Reproductive Health Protection Act, something like that. I forgot the exact name is, to safeguard against a potential Supreme Court ruling that strikes down Roe v. Wade. So you're seeing Congress. Now, by the way, that's a legitimate function of Congress to make laws to safeguard against judicial intrusion. That's a completely legitimate function. But Schumer is not doing so out of a spirit of duty to what Congress should be doing. He's doing so to protect his own political interests, which is another problem. So, Congress can absolutely execute its duty, its power to safeguard against judicial intrusion. But most of the time, that only happens when Congress disagrees with the judicial intrusion. So, in other words, there's no conviction; there's just convenience in that case.
Yeah, and part of this, Christian, is motivated by this discussion is motivated by Pennsylvania politics. We're actually in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court back in 2018 said that Republicans had gerrymandered the map, and therefore they were going to pick somebody else to draw the map that would be the political map for them. And then now, fast forward to 2022, now they're doing the same thing again, where it was supposed to go through a political process this time. They couldn't reach an agreement, and now they're just going to draw the maps on their own. And it's like, this cannot keep happening. Anybody who's in Congress, Republican or Democrat, quite frankly, can't have a judiciary make the call every 4 years, every 10 years, because that undermines not only Congress in and of itself, which, according to the Federalist, is supposed to be the predominant, the highest body, we'll say, in the U.S., and then it also undermines the judiciary. Is this really a court, or is this a quasi-legislative institution where people, where non-democracy, because there's no representation, gets to flourish? It's all mad, Christian. Makes me 1,000% upset. And I think if people were more in tune to the theory of what's going on, they would be equally as outraged about this, particularly in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and I'll add this exact same thing's happening in North Carolina. I mean, quite literally, there's a sort of hot potato going back and forth between the legislature and the courts on this issue of redistricting. And eventually, what happened was the Republicans had a redistricting session. They had it open to the public, and they even said, okay, if any of you want to come and you want to draw your own maps, please do so, and we'll put it in our calculation. The Democrats said, okay, no, you are hating minorities. You're just doing this to disfranchise people. We're going to sue. They sue. The courts say, okay, we change things. So Congress, the legislature changed things. Eventually, it gets up to the Supreme Court, who 2 weeks ago said, okay, not only are you going to change things, we're going to change things for you, and we're going to redraw the maps for you. So you have the judiciary redrawing the maps and overtaking the duties of a congressional body, of a legislative body. So the same thing's happening here. And it is disappointing. It is a result of this defect in understanding of the relationship between the branches of the government. So I agree with you.
Yeah, that's crazy. And for people who support democracy, which is what apparently one would think the Democratic Party is supposed to be for, they themselves should not be able to tolerate this. It's so fascinating that they have this party label called Democrat, and yet in the state of Pennsylvania, they let Tom Wolf limit the powers. They're happy to let Joe Biden issue a mandate that will affect 100 million people. They're happy to let the courts do whatever it is that they please. How is that democratic? Okay, either change the name of your party, okay, or put the red star on and say that you're communist, or say that you're socialist. But this is not your party. And either you're lying to people, or you have to change your party registration, because this is crazy and it's getting out of hand.
Yeah, democracy is worse enough. Oligarchy in the name of democracy is even more dubious. I mean, but just to ask you a question, I know this is not on our topic, but it's Pennsylvania politics. What's your opinion of Dr. Amendment Oz? Are you hopeful about it?
Well, Christian, I'm not trained to have any opinion on the actual races as it is now, just because
Yeah.
I don't know what the polling is going to be. And
Yeah.
I'll just candidly say that I don't always agree with any candidate about anything.
Hmm.
And I'm
Hmm.
in part worried that people in the Senate believe in term limits, but I personally don't have evidence to think that the founders intended the
I
senators to
agree.
have term limits.
I agree.
So
I
that's
agree.
that's what's very challenging for me to accept, is anybody who wants to run on term limits. That's not what the Senate's supposed to do. But also, if one is a partisan, then you wouldn't want your seat to be contested every 12 years. So it wouldn't make sense from even a strategic point of view. But I want to keep
Yeah.
this moving here. Uh, we got two other pieces. One, I guess, we'll just breeze over. It's called Ignore and Rebuild. Basically, the premise in that, and for the folks who are listening, you can go to zigmundreichenbach.com to look at all these past articles and really catch up, because I'm trying to help philosophize, if you will, a better way, a Republican way, as the founders intended, and to get our modern world back in line with what it is that we're supposed to have, instead of having this administrative socialist tyranny thing going on. We have to cancel that. But one way
Agreed.
that I'm mentioning that we can is that, instead of just spending all this time squealing about this socialist stuff on Facebook and sharing all this stuff, we can just ignore and rebuild. We can rebuild our own institutions, where if we're truly dissatisfied with what's going on in public school, we don't even have to direct our frustrations towards them. We can just quietly rebuild on our own, and then before anybody knows it, we'll be closer to a free society. Christian, what are your thoughts on that? And do you think we should spend more time being keyboard warriors, or do you think that we should try to invest some of our time or other forms of capital to building these pro-capitalist, pro-Republican institutions?
This is a variation of the question you asked a few weeks ago. I've noticed that. I like how you phrased this variation too. It's much better. It's not as exclusionary. And so, in that sense, yes, I agree. We should be working on either reclaiming institutions that are possible to be reclaimed. Not all institutions. This is the problem that some conservative culture warriors face. Not all institutions are possible to be reclaimed. Some of them have fallen so off the deep end that it's not a matter of reclaiming them, it's a matter of contesting them through other forces. And this Sawyer idea comes in, building up our own institutions, building up, and it doesn't have to be anything, like, it doesn't have to be like a public policy think tank in DC. It can be as simple as, of course, a gathering of concerned parents in a certain area that want to advocate for homeschooling kids or advocate for school choice. That's an institution. I mean, because the institutions can exist in so many different ways, shapes, and forms, and all of us can have a role in having institutions that can do good things. So yes, I agree with you entirely. I think that sometimes the solution is to go out there, create your own institution. Again, not think tank, not always a think tank, but sometimes, just a gathering of people that you can get together or you can advocate for a goal, and try to push back that way, and withdraw your consent, withdraw your resources from the institutions that are not doing good. I agree.
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to do here at the ZRS with Christian Watson in this podcast, is ignore the haters and rebuild and move on and be able to do our own thing. So hopefully you guys will continue to support us and go to the website, and also go to Christian's YouTube, so that way we can actually rebuild something, instead of getting on TV and whining and complaining, which actually I think is a perverse incentive. I think there are some commentators out there that are happy when Biden does something stupid, because then they can complain about it for maybe 2 hours on the show when they didn't have anything planned. And I think that's a perverse incentive, and I don't think those people are doing enough to decentralize the media, or to help people get their own sense of sovereignty back, or to restore more power to the states. And in that way, those people are culpable for that. So that's the final word on that. The last article we have, and we got 4 articles this week instead of 5, I got to get back to doing the full 5. But sometimes work just gets the best of me. But this one pertains to Marx academics and this idea of exploitation. And it's a fun thing to think about, because when Marx famously said workers of the world unite, he definitely didn't mean in the basements of learning we now call universities. Okay. After all, and this is straight from the article on the site here, after all, most professors teaching Marx aren't really workers. At best, the closest these professors get to work is to enviously watching successful members of the middle class enjoy the fruits of their labor while they choke on the bitterness of their own resentment. And so for them, trying to cope with these juvenile emotions is the closest they get to real work. So all that is to say, most of these professors teaching Marx are not workers. And in fact, in the Marxist utopia, these people would serve no function. There would be no need to have professors. So in some sense, anybody who's a Marxist professor should actually resign and go on a people strike and hold signs and not shower with a bunch of like-minded socialists. I mean, if they're going to be ideologically consistent. But what Marx was also saying about this idea of exploitation was that he wanted to help how laborers, actual blue-collar workers, could live in a world free of exploitation back at a time when laborers were working 10, 12 plus hour days in grimy, dreary conditions. Okay, so his idea is based on a time that doesn't exist today. Most workers really do not work in grimy, dreary conditions. In fact, if you look at it, Marx might be sympathetic to the point that the people doing the real exploitation today are people who are saddling us with debt, which includes some of these Marxist professors. And because it's clear that it's the case that capitalists aren't forcing one-sided deals on laborers these days in a way that Marx would clearly find concern with, but it is clear that over 43 million Americans are saddled with government-backed student loan debt. And I think Marx would indeed find that exploitative, and he may even be inclined to update his thoughts about capitalism. Christian, what are your thoughts about all the stuff that I mentioned? And is it ideologically consistent to have Marxist professors lording power over people and putting them into oppressive debt?
Two things. The first thing I thought when you mentioned the relationship between Marx and universities and Marxist professors needing to resign, I thought, wouldn't Marx view being a university professor, which is a white-collar job, as a luxury of the bourgeoisie? It's very interesting. I think that's exactly what he would do, because he had a very a class-driven way, a class-driven dynamic of his understanding of the world and history, right? Dialectical materialism, so to speak. And so I find that quite interesting that these professors have assigned themselves to a category that Marx himself would have hated. But then again, there's a difference between Marx and Marxists. There's a difference between Aristotle and Aristotelians. A lot of these folks tend to take whereas Marx had no prescriptions, he had a prescription. These Marxists have a lot of prescriptions. It's very interesting. Now, of course, these prescriptions flow from a reading of Marxist theory. And we should never say, well, these people are just misinterpreting Marx. No, they're not misinterpreting him. They're taking him to a place that he never went himself, but it's conceivable that he could have went if he wanted to go that way. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I lost my thought, but you helped me. I lost my thought. Yeah.
So your point though is well taken, in that these people aren't claiming to be Marx per se, but they claim to put their own spin on his own theory. But, I don't know the extent to which then is indeed true. And regardless, they themselves would have to answer for how their own hand in oppressing other people, according to Marxist theory. Okay, they would have to explain that. They, at the very least, they would have to offer some justification by saying, I'm allowed to oppress people because I'm doing good, and I don't exist within the traditional categories because I'm so good, I exist outside of it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think
yeah,
that that's what they indeed perhaps think. But even then,
yeah.
that's not a strong justification. And really, anybody who claims to be a Marxist should still be able to take aim at all the dent these universities are putting people into, and how that's not
Agreed.
exploitation for political votes. I don't understand.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think debt slavery is the modern day form of slavery that no one really wants to talk about in a meaningful way, in those terms, rather. A lot of folks will warn about student loan debt, like Dave Ramsey and so on, but very few people talk about it in terms of slavery. And it is a form of, I suppose, voluntarily entered slavery. Because you enter it, wanting to get value of something, typically a degree, if you're in the student world, and then you exit it being saddled by all of these terms, having lower prospects of being able to buy a home quicker, being able to start a family without going into default, without being unstable, being able to buy some of your first assets, which all those things which accrue, help build wealth. So for eventually when you retire, you can retire in peace. That vision of the American dream, all that kind of stuff is being threatened by many things. But the primary thing I think is being threatened is by debt. And and not just debt itself, because debt can be okay if it's limited and you have a plan to address it. The problem is a lot of students are taking out inordinate amounts of money for degrees that will not give them a big ROI. These days, I think my friends who didn't go to college and went to go practice a trade like welding or something of that sort, became engineers or even truckers. A lot of them are doing much better, have no debt, have much more disposable income, are already starting families, are already being able to go out and get houses. Maybe not in this economy, but they're able to go out and do that. They have the means to do that because they're not saddled by this debt. So yeah, there's a big
Well,
problem, and it is
let's talk
exploitative.
about this idea that people are agreeing to it voluntarily, because to
They
me,
are.
I don't think by normal standards of justification that we can say that people are voluntarily taking on student loan debt. I don't think that 43 million people totally, quote unquote, agree to that. There has to be some kind
Mhm.
of other exploitation, which involves, at least in my mind, public schools and unwitting parents signing their kid into a socialist program or a student loan program without the child having any way to know any better, because they don't work, they don't have any experience, they don't have their friends don't mostly know any better. So they're getting all kinds of bad advice. Just like if a business sells a defective product and they don't proactively mention, hey, like for example, coffee, for example, at McDonald's, if you buy coffee, it says coffee's hot. So that way, if you spill it, there's no liability. When it comes to student loan debt, they don't say, hey, this student loan debt is probably going to stop you from owning a house. It's going to stop you from starting a family. It's going to make your life this much more difficult in these ways. If you don't take it seriously, you're definitely not going to be able to get a house because you're not going to have the credit score to be able to do so. None of that stuff is mentioned. So they have a special provision in carve out where they can sell people defective products up front, and there's no implications, in a way that I could only think that Marx would find that oppressive,
Okay.
or
Yes. No.
exploitative.
No. No one tells you if you overborrow. Well, okay. The lender does not tell you if you overborrow, these are the consequences. But there are more than enough ways for people to know what the consequences are. Even at public schools today, they are teaching people of like different kinds of ways to fund your higher education and what certain things mean. I was taught that if you take out loans, you got to pay them back. Now, there are some people who only have to take out a very small amount of loans, and therefore their futures are not all that oppressed. But there are a lot of kids that go beyond the recommended amount and they take out a lot of loans, and that fiscal irresponsibility, it can be talked to financial ignorance, sure,
Yeah.
but these days the information about what it means to borrow money It's widely available. Well, so I don't necessarily think that they're being sold a defective product. I think they're
Oh,
using the product wrong. You're
so
not supposed to take out. You're not supposed to take out $100,000 of debt for a gender studies degree. And I would even question the wisdom of taking it out for a law school. Well, most grad students have over $100,000 of debt. They spend their entire lives, no matter how much they're getting paid, paying that back. And a lot of them know they're going to be doing that. And it's a risk they want to take because they're bound by this sort of social obligation to obtain status. Mom wants me to be a lawyer or a doctor. Dad wants me to be a lawyer or a doctor. I have to go do this. And that's the wrong mentality to have.
yeah, but
Maybe people
typically
should,
banks
yeah,
themselves don't give loans to people who don't have their own collateral.
you're right.
Like
Banks do.
they don't give loans to people who live on the streets. In fact, they're not even as loose. Banks aren't even as loose with their money with ordinary business people. They would not
Banks.
give out. Yes, banks themselves would not give out the loans that the federal government gives out to people who don't know. Those banks won't even give that money out to people who have a more proven track record than
Yes.
what kids do. So I'm not
Yeah.
saying that that people shouldn't take personal responsibility, but it's not unambiguously clear. And if it is, it's certainly not well understood. The implications and ramifications of this debt, such that it makes a lot of these Marxist professors and socialist professors look hypocritical. They're talking about oppression and they're talking about exploiting people. And meanwhile, they're encouraging people. And again, out of 43 million people, I don't believe that all 43 million, okay, really understood what it was that they were getting into. Otherwise, that number wouldn't be as high as it
Whose
is.
fault is that, Zygmunt?
Well, it's not any one party's fault, but it is
Yes, it
certainly
is.
clear. It's certainly
Zygmunt, if you're
clear
going
that
to
the
take out
schools are
money,
not doing all that they can to make sure that
okay.
people are understanding what it is that's going on. In fact, this is why during the Trump administration, what they argued for, and part of their plan was to actually have private banks consult with people before they took out these loans, and also showed them on the basis of the different majors how much they could potentially earn on the basis of those majors. That was a better, more transparent proposal. But that's not what these socialists are advocating for. And they're allowing an exploitative practice, perhaps even according to Marx, to perpetuate and to go on. And I don't think that's helpful. And I think they should quit.
I think personal responsibility is very important in the age of the internet and the generation that was raised on the internet, Gen Z.
Mhm.
They have the ability to listen to people like Dave Ramsey or to go out and research about student loans. The headlines are ubiquitous about how student loan debt is crushing and it's hurting people. So
Mhm.
if someone does not take responsibility to see, okay, do I really want to borrow this much money? In some ways, that has to be their fault. Now, in my own personal experience, I knew what I was getting into. When I borrowed, I knew what I was getting into. And in retrospect, I wish I hadn't. I wish I had just gone to community college, but I was more worried about the status. Oh, if I go to a university and things, oh, it'll be more official. I'll have the status of going to university. I could have been virtually debt free if I had gone to community college. I could have still done my podcast, still read philosophy. I could have done everything I did in college in community college. It would have took more work from me. But a lot of kids are told, well, community college, that's just where the dumb people go. That's where the scrubs go.
Mhm.
And there creates this sort of capture of status in their minds that directs them to these more expensive universities. And that's a problem. It's a big problem. So
Yeah,
maybe we
and
should be
so
emphasizing alternatives.
so
Maybe
so
that's the
Christian,
solution.
I
Yeah.
I'm agreeing that people can take personal responsibility for a bad decision, but I'm
Yeah.
also saying that you can agree, you can take responsibility for a decision and then say, well, this person wasn't totally transparent about the terms of this transaction too. And therefore that in some cases those parties ought to take some responsibility for their complicity, being complicit in perpetuating a bad system, because most of the administrators giving out these loans clearly know that they have a bad impact on the kids. They all must. at this point. In fact, those people have to have such a greater knowledge of what's going on than the individual kids, because they work in that system. And so therefore, with greater knowledge comes greater responsibility, and therefore a lot of the blame does go on these socialist universities that are exploiting people through debt, and they ought to find some way to adjudicate that. They either ought to be honest socialists and get out of the university system and stop profiting off of people in that way, or they ought to go live in a commune, or they ought to sing Kumbaya and start a drum circle with Marxist reading groups. But whatever's going on is certainly not the most honest or logically consistent way, is all I'm trying to drive to.
Okay. You have to sign a contract before you take out loans. Most folks don't read it because it's pretty damn long. But I mean, there's more than enough information about you have to pick a borrowing period. Okay, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years, 12 years? And you'll be informed of the interest rates. And if you do a little bit of calculation, you can see what that's going to do to you. The problem is most people just don't care about that until it's too late. That's the problem, Zigmund.
Yeah, correct.
I mean,
and I'm saying that bad people know that, and they could adjudicate or address those things further ahead of time by arming people with better information in their more formative years.
The information is out there.
Particularly people who are socialist and have this professed allegiance to fairness, and yet they're selling people into things that they don't know anything about. That's not being honest. That's not really being consistent with this belief in socialism or Marxism. In fact, under Marxism, you would think then all these universities should be free in some way ahead of time, not after the fact. But to add student loan debt into that is, well, it's just not consistent with the professed values. So all I'm trying to say is, Christian, yes, I agree. We should all take personal responsibility. We should all do that. But other people should also have their feet held to the fire when they're not living consistently with their values, as I believe most Marxists and socialists are not being consistent. That's all.
Yeah, those are two separate things, but so I agree with you on that last point. Yeah.
Sometimes it just takes some time to work through, man. Well, I know, Christian,
yeah.
You got to go. It's been a real pleasure to have you.
Oh yeah, you too, man. Yeah.
And it looks like we're starting to pick up a little more momentum, all thanks to you, buddy. So thanks a lot for that. Make sure to check out Christian's YouTube, Pensive Politics, and you can also find him on Twitter at official C. Watson. In the meantime, if you haven't checked out ZigmundReichenbach.com, where you are able to check out the things that we discussed. Kathy, we'll hopefully see you next week. I know you got some comments that I didn't totally address here. And that's all we have. We hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you next Sunday at 4. Have a great one.